Well, the name Gabby Petito is in the news again. This time, her family is suing the Moab Police Department in Utah for $50 million. Should they get it? Well, we're going to talk about that and more on this episode of Charlie Crimebuster. It's what some people have been calling the fastest minutes in podcasting. Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of the Charlie Crimebuster Crime Talk. Today we discuss the traffic stop of Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie. You see, her parents do not like the way that the police handled it, and they're suing the department for millions of dollars. I think like 40 million or so. First, let me welcome all of our brand new listeners to this episode. We do pick up new people every week, and we're thrilled to have you on board the crime train. Now, please feel free to reach out with a shout-out. You can reach me at charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you with questions, suggestions, agree or disagree, or even just want to say hi. Again, reach me, charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Hey, also, if you'd like to support the program, well, go to peacemakernetwork.com. Hit the donate button. Any amount will be appreciated. Will help us with our support of those that are on the front line of crime fighting, law enforcement, first responders, and of course our military. That is peacemakernetwork.com. All of these links, well, we're going to add them in our show notes. Now, our focus today, well, the parents of Gabby Petito have officially filed a lawsuit against Utah's Moab City Police Department over their daughter's death. A press release says that the lawsuit was filed on Thursday for, quote, the police department's failures and negligence that ultimately led to the 22-year-old Gabby Petito being killed last year. Well, the lawsuit, it was filed against the Moab Police Department, Police Chief Brett Edge, Assistant Chief Braden Palmer, and Officers Daniel Robbins and Eric Pratt, as well as 10 unidentified individuals. Now, the lawsuit claims that the department's negligent hiring and failure to properly train, well, that led to Gabby's death. And they are seeking not 40 but $50 million in damages. Now, according to the lawsuit, Petito and then her fiancé, Brian Laundrie, well, they were in Moab when someone saw Laundrie hit Petito, called 911. Petito even told her family that he had hit her, and the family attempted to make plans for her to return home, but stepped back once the police got involved in the situation. Well, Petito's body was found weeks later. That was there in Wyoming, though, not Utah. It was near a campground outside of Grand Teton National Park. And Laundrie, he was also missing after her death. He was found dead and reserved in Florida. There was a little notebook, though, that was found next to his body, which he claimed responsibility for her death. Now, the lawsuit goes on to say that despite the witness's report, the officers treated Brian as if he were the victim of domestic abuse rather than the perpetrator. That's what the lawsuit alleges. They say that the officers misinterpreted Gabby's extreme emotional distress. They saw it as a cause of domestic violence rather than as the result of domestic violence. They said that Officer Pratt, that was Robin's training officer, that he in particular was fundamentally biased in his approach to the investigation, that he chose to believe Gabby's abuser, ignoring evidence that Gabby was a victim, intentionally looking for loopholes to get around the requirements of Utah law and his duty to protect Gabby, quote unquote. Now, the attorney, James McConkey, who is representing the family, he said that the lawsuit, well, it's meant to demand accountability, try to lead to systemic changes for victims of domestic abuse. Goes on to say, quote, the epidemic of domestic violence is a silent killer. Of course it is. We agree with that. A sign and symptoms which often go unrecognized by those not familiar with interpersonal violence. He goes on to say the affliction could well affect each one of us or a loved one at some points in our life. sometimes with tragic consequences. The press release says the police department and its officers failed Gabby by failing to follow the law to protect Gabby when they had opportunity to do so. Well, the Moab Police, they also conducted an investigation to the officers' response to that domestic violence incident. They did say in that report that the officers made several unintentional mistakes that stemmed from the fact that the officers failed to cite Miss Petito, not Brian, but Miss Petito, for domestic violence. That report did recommend improvements to police policies, but the city did say they believed that their officers showed kindness, respect, empathy in the handling of this incident. The police department statement went on to say the city of Moab sends out our sincere condolences to the Petito family. Our hearts go out to them as they continue to deal with the tragic loss of their daughter. That's what the city said in their own announcement about that investigation. So, what about this traffic stop? Are the cops responsible for Gabby's death? I'm going to answer that in just a moment, but right now it is time for what we call our Crazy Crook story. You see, we share those to kind of lighten the load in a lot of these gruesome things that we cover on this podcast. Now, as an investigator myself, I have become quite curious as to the things that burglars sometimes do in houses where they rob and steal from. In fact, many times I would ask when investigating a residential burglary, I would ask the resident to check their refrigerator. They would sometimes look at me like I was crazy when I asked that question. Not me, not the crazy crook, but me being crazy for asking them to look in the fridge. But then when they looked in the fridge, they were amazed because they did find that sometimes things were missing. You see, there are often times when a burglar would just stop and fix a sandwich as they forged through the home. Well, for sure, that was for some people unusual, but not so unusual for those who investigate such crime. But this crook, the one, our crazy crook we're talking about today, well, he had one that is rather unusual. His M.O., well, it included something different indeed. This was an East Coast burglar, and guess what? He loved shiny shoes. In fact, sometimes he polishes his shoes 2 or 3 times a day. It just appears that he could not help himself. And get this. This burglar, well, he was convicted after evidence showed he paused during a burglary long enough to shine his shoes. Hey, maybe he just wanted to dress for success as he did his bad deed. Only problem? This crazy crook got caught at it. For you see, my friend, he left his can of shoe polish. And if that wasn't bad enough, he left, well, wait for it. He left his personalized wipe rag. That's right, rag with his name on it. Left it behind. No wonder when he was questioned by the public defender, well, you almost have a fetish about your shoes, don't you? The man said, well, yeah, yes, I do. Yes, I do. And he, my friend, he was convicted of this. Well, there you have it. And please forgive me for this remark. But my friend, if the shoe fits, oh, I said, forgive me for that remark. But that, my friend, is indeed Charlie Crimebuster's Crazy Crook Story of the Week. Now back to our main focus. By the way, if you go to Charlie Crimebuster, that's charliecrimebuster.com, you're going to find the past episodes of the Gabby Petito case, should you not be familiar with it. In fact, we predicted many things prior to the investigation findings on that series, including where Brian Laundrie was when he was on the run and a nationwide manhunt was in progress for him. We even outdid Dog the Bounty Hunter in predicting that one. We also did, of course, a episode on the traffic stop with a couple prior to Gabby's death. But the news this last Thursday of Gabby's family suing the Moab Police Department for $50 million, well, it brings us to re-examine that simple traffic stop. Well, first, let me tell you about the 2 officers whose actions are under nationwide review. They are mentioned in the lawsuit. I'm not going to tell you about the chief and the assistant chief, because it's common to always sue the leadership in those type of lawsuits. In fact, when I was a chief deputy of the sheriff's department, I could expect to be sued any time any of my deputies were sued. It was just part of the process. A process, by the way, that eventually leads to attempting to get money out of the agency itself and its insurance provider. That's where the big pockets are. And that leads me to another factor that I want to mention. You see, it's sometimes a common fact, in fact, too many times, agencies will settle such suits even though the officers may not be at blame. They would settle it because it would actually cost more to take the matter to the trial than to give in some cash to those who were suing. Well, I sure hope that this isn't exactly what this department does. I hope that they'll stand in there with their officers. You see, officers are often collateral damage of such actions. They do not deserve that. They deserve to be cleared completely in such suits. Well, anyway, let's look at the two officers. There was the officer who was the investigating officer in this case, Officer Robbins. And there was another officer that was his TO, or what we call the training officer. You see, Officer Robbins, he was a rookie. He was hired in May of 2021, had no prior law enforcement training other than starting there. He had less than a half a year of experience actually on the job. Now, his training officer was Officer Pratt, P-R-A-T-T. He had worked in prior law enforcement, had 16 years of law enforcement experience. He was the acting field training officer to Robbins, and would respond to most all the calls that Robbins would respond to assist and guide the young officer. Now, I should add, there are two other officers on the scene. They were two park rangers. You see, the vehicle was stopped at an entrance to a national park. Those officers was Park Ranger Ryan Carl and Park Ranger Melissa Hulse. Neither of these officers are listed in the lawsuit, to my knowledge, that is. Now, so what happened that involved these two officers? Well, on August the 12th, a caller who called 911 told dispatchers that he saw what appeared to be a domestic dispute between a man and a woman, where the male was hitting the female. He gave a description of the van that the couple had left in. Now, Officer Robbins, after hearing descriptions of this van, he observed this vehicle driving erratically, speeding. He did have probable cause to initiate a traffic stop. And the couple, Brian Laundrie and Gabby Petito, they were on a cross-country trip, started in New York's Long Island. Now, that van was speeding. It did hit a curb at the entrance to the Arches National Park there in Utah, and the Moab Police Department was responding. Now, the male, Brian Laundrie, 23 years of age, he said the couple got into a minor scuffle that began when he climbed into the van with dirty feet. Gabby Petito, well, she even faulted her own desire to keep the van clean. And after this traffic stop, she was reported missing a month after the traffic stop. And then, unfortunately, tragically, her strangled body was discovered on September the 19th at the edge of Grand Teton National Park, not in Utah, all the way in Wyoming, 500 miles away. Now, Laundrie, well, he was the only person ever identified by law enforcement as a person of interest. He himself, as we said earlier, was found dead of self-inflicted gunshot wound, one wound, in the swamp after returning alone to his parents' home here in Florida. Now, let's talk about this. While the Utah law says police shall arrest aggressors in domestic violence assaults, rather than citing Petito, though, the two officers found the incident was more of a mental or emotional health break. Now, the lawsuit says that the officers misinterpreted Gabby's extreme emotional distress, seeing it as the cause of domestic violence rather than the result of domestic violence. My friend, it seems to be the heart of the lawsuit that the officers should have seen Gabby was the victim and Brian was the aggressor. But let me remind you, these officers only had this one incident to investigate. They did not have knowledge of anything that happened prior to this incident, nor did they have some sort of crystal ball telling them of what would happen in the future. They only had one incident, and here is what they found. Now, the statements that they received from both Gabby and Brian, who, by the way, were separated immediately at the traffic stop, so they could not be talking together about what they were going to say to the police, both of those people making their statements, it was apparent from the statements that Gabby was the primary aggressor in this incident, not Brian Laundrie. You see, she had admitted herself that she was upset, that she had OZ and anxiety issues. And it appeared by what she was saying to the officers that she was taking it out on Brian. Now, in addition to the statements of Brian and Gabby, there were other witnesses there at the scene, and they testified in their statement to the police that Brian seemed to be only defending himself from Gabby in this incident. Other witnesses. And then the statement of Brian on the scene, well, it too was consistent to Gabby's statement that she was the aggressor. Though, of course, Brian said he had no desire to press charges, and Brian did not appear to be seriously injured at all. Now, what minor injuries that were observed and documented, well, that all pointed to Gabby again being the primary aggressor. In fact, my friend, no way you can look at this in any other way without saying the preponderance of evidence in this incident pointed to Gabby being the aggressor. Now, a lot of officers know, and no doubt in my mind, Officer Pratt was aware that there are sometimes times when someone we know from a past experience of long-term being a victim of long-term domestic violence, sometimes they can get arrested for committing an act of domestic violence against their long-term abuser. That abuser is called a predominant abuser. Gabby, in this situation, it appears, by what we know now, was the primary abuser. But let me say again, officers cannot act on evidence they are not aware of. They cannot arrest or cite on hunches. They cannot arrest and cite on feelings. They can only use the evidence that is before them. And the evidence that was before them on this traffic stop, no doubt in my mind, pointed to the fact that Gabby was the aggressor in this incident. However, if they even knew that she could be a victim of long-time abuse, why then did they not arrest Brian? Well, it's very simple. While that could have been, and most likely was the case, that Brian was the predominant abuser, the long-term abuser, again, they did not have evidence to arrest him or cite him. You see, in order for them to arrest Brian, they would have had to ignore the statements of the two other witnesses. They would have to ignore the statement of both Brian and Gabby. They would have to ignore the visible and evident injuries to Brian. In order to arrest Brian, they would have to ignore and violate, I might say, his own constitutional rights from unreasonable search and seizure. There is no way that they could arrest or cite Brian Laundrie on the statement of that one witness who was driving by and saw the incident and said that it appeared that Brian was striking Gabby. He only saw a flash of it as it drove by. Other witness said that it appeared that Brian was defending himself. And then you have the injuries. And then you have the statements of both of them. So, my friend, if they could not arrest or cite Brian, why did they not arrest or cite Gabby? And would that have made a difference in the murder of Gabby Petito? Now I'm going to answer that question in just a moment. But now it's time for what we call our Courageous Citizen of the Week story. We also take time to point out those who take courage as citizens. We attempt to recognize them in just about every one of our episodes. Now, just recently here in Florida, the school shooter in the Parkland High School shooting, well, he was sentenced. And I have to say, his sentence was a slap in the face to many of us here in Florida. Many of us, and especially the parents of those precious children that were shot by this gunman in the school, who we thought, and I agree with them, that the death penalty was made for this situation. If it was ever made for any situation, it would certainly be this one, when so many people were killed and injured. And my friend, I got to admit, we were disappointed by that act of that jury. But we could not be disappointed in the act of another young man. And this wouldn't happen last year in Noblesville, Indiana. This is when a middle school science teacher, a guy by the name of Jason Seaman. Jason encountered a school shooter. And when he saw him, he reportedly threw a basketball at him and then tackled him. Now, Seaman, even while he was doing this, was shot 3 times. Did you get that? Shot 3 times. And the 13-year-old student was shot 7 times. But thank God, both of them survived. And my friend Jason Seaman, no doubt, saved many, many lives that day. Instead of thinking of his own safety, he acted in courage, and he saved lives. My friend, I'm saying to you today that on this episode of Charlie Crimebuster, Jason Seaman is indeed Charlie Crimebuster's Citizen Hero of the Week. So now we're back to our main focus. So they could not arrest Brian Laundrie. Why did they not cite or arrest Gabby Petito? Well, let's look at the state law. Utah State Law Code 77-72, which states the primary duty of law enforcement officers responding to domestic violence is to protect the victim and enforce the law. Well, 2A says, in addition to the arrest power, it's described that when the officer has cause to believe that an act of domestic violence has been committed, the peace officer shall arrest without warrant or issue a citation to any person the peace officer has probable cause to believe has committed an act of domestic violence. So, the officers now would have to look at Gabby. Did she commit domestic violence? Well, they wanted to look to see if the slap that Gabby gave Brian was domestic violence. So they decided, in turn, to look at the law in Utah regarding assault. A slap would be an assault. And the assault law reads this way: an attempt with lawful force or violence to do bodily injury to another or to act committed with unlawful force or violence that cause bodily injury to another or creates a substantial risk of bodily injury to another. Well, with that, they thought, well, the attempt to do bodily injury, well, that's explicit with the intent to do bodily injury. So they asked Gabby, what did you really intend to do when you slapped Brian? She said she only wanted him to be quiet. She did not intend to injure him in any way. Well, my friend, the bottom line here was that the officers did not want to cite or arrest this young lady. He and those in their minds was just having an emotional episode. They did not consider it as a deliberate act of violence. And they did not feel that Brian Laundrie was in risk of any bodily harm. And they did not feel that Gabby should be punished with a record of domestic abuse because of an emotional episode. And so they used the assault law to back up their finding. And instead, they separated the two for the night. They provided lodging for Brian and allowed Gabby to stay in her van because they were staying in their van as they were going across country. It was volunteer compliance. The officer did say, I can't force you not to contact each other, but it was implied that they would voluntarily comply. Now, could they have cited or arrested Gabby? Well, no doubt they could. Just as an officer could pull you over and cite you for going 56 miles per hour in a 55 mile per hour limit, but uses discretion not to. Or perhaps pulls you over for speeding and decides to give you a warning ticket instead of a speeding ticket. And if they had chosen to arrest Gabby, well, my friend, it could. It could have led to more frustration and blame on Gabby to fuel the predominant aggressor, which was Brian. While Gabby was the primary aggressor, arresting her could have provided the predominant aggressor. Could even have made life more difficult to Gabby. You see, my friend, officers sometimes have to use discretion, common sense in what they do on the street. Now, to be plain, the officers were not perfect in their actions in this traffic stop. They did make mistakes. They did not interview the first caller who said he saw Brian hitting Gabby. However, even if they had found that first caller who just drove by and saw it in an instant, there was other evidence of other people that were there who saw it and said that Brian was defending himself. There were the statements of Gabby and Brian, and the injuries which was consistent on Brian that Gabby was the aggressor. Even if they had talked to that first caller who saw it while he was passing by, that doesn't mean that they would have made any different finding. They did make a mistake by not following up on that, and they did make a mistake in some of the report writing. and they did not give referral matter or pamphlets to them that they could have read about domestic violence. When it comes to the end of the day, though, my friend, there is no way that these officers could be blamed for a murder that occurred 18 days later, 500 miles away. And even during that time, Brian had left for 6 days on a trip to Florida by himself and then returned later to murder Gabby. It'd be like you going to your doctor and you were being treated by flu. Someone going to the doctor was being treated by flu, something that invaded your body. Yes, it did happen. But then blamed the doctor because you had a heart attack 30 days later. You see, my friend, I do understand. I understand completely the parents wanting to blame someone for the death of their daughter. Brian killed himself, so he's not around anymore for them to blame. They had already started to blame Brian's parents and started a lawsuit to them. But meaning not to sound harsh, though, her mother and the parents, they were on the phone with Gabby during this traffic stop. They were on the phone with him for a long time. And her mom, they knew more about Brian and Gabby than the police did. If they did not see the danger, if they did not stop right then, fly out to wherever their daughter was and rescue their daughter when they could, why would they expect the police in a traffic stop, who only had a very limited time of contact with these people, to be able to see the future? Probably the parents did not see that, and neither did the cops. Bottom line, this lawsuit should be dismissed. Now, the department's already done a review of the officers, and they did suggest and make it a fact that their officers are going to receive a lot more training on domestic abuse, and that'll all be very positive and very good. But even with additional training, they will not be able to foresee the future. And officers can only act upon the information they have at any given moment. Mr. Judge, I hope you will dismiss this lawsuit. And Department, please do not settle and place blame on these officers who did their job as best they could with the information that they had. They thought they were doing a favor by not marking this young lady as a domestic abuser herself, tying her up from getting certain jobs, putting it upon her record, when they did not see that Gabby herself was the kind of aggressor that would have done bodily harm to anyone. And they had no evidence that Brian was that aggressor at that time. Now, before we go today, I'm going to have to say, if you find yourself in a domestic abuse situation, or you know someone who is, please, my friend, go to the domestic abuse hotline. That's 1-800-799-7233. That is 1-800-799-7233. Or you can text the word START, S-T-A-R-T, START to 88788. Text START to 88788. Or go to their website, and there you can chat online. All of this will be listed in our show notes. Please, again, if you're in that situation, you know somebody who is, help them out. Get them to the National Abuse Hotline. It'll be there in our show notes. So until this next time, this is Charlie Crimebuster reminding you, be safe, be alert. For the life you save, it may be your very own.